Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. The Iran front is heating up again, and to help us make sense of why exactly the U.S. and Iran are once more trading fire on a daily basis, I'm thrilled to have back on Dr. Naysan Rafati to explain how we've reached this point and where it all may be headed. Naysan is, of course, the senior Iran analyst at the International Crisis Group in Washington and was previously a postdoc fellow at the RAND Corporation, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the IFRI think tank in Paris. He also holds a doctorate from Oxford University and, more importantly, is an old and dear friend of mine and of this podcast. This was a great conversation with Naysan on how the Iranian regime and Donald Trump view their respective positions since the initial ceasefire deal was signed last month, what both sides are trying to accomplish with the military escalation in the Strait of Hormuz and really across much of the Middle East, and the question on, if not everyone's minds, then certainly our minds, and definitely my mind, what does this all mean for Israel? But first, a few thoughts from me. So Iran is back in the news in a big way, obviously, which we'll get into with Naysan in just a minute. But it's important to note that we're recording this on Wednesday late afternoon Tel Aviv time, in case things do develop/escalate before this episode goes up, likely tomorrow. But the other big news of the week, Israel is heading to elections. Officially, finally, mercifully. Election date has been set for October 27th. Literally the last day possible by law for this current Knesset session, and meaning that this current Netanyahu government has run its full 4-year term. Remarkable. By Friday, we should add, the Knesset will disperse for the final time and head into election season. God help us all. Election day, it's still a long time away. A lot can happen in the next 100 or so days. So stay tuned to this podcast and to Israel Policy Forum more generally for all your Israeli election needs. And there will be many, many needs to unravel everything that will happen in the coming few months. They say this ahead of every election here in Israel. I've said it on this podcast for months, but really this coming election will arguably be the most consequential and even existential for Israel and, well, Israel's future. And we should also add, it will be hugely consequential for Gaza, for Lebanon, for the Palestinian Authority and the West Bank in general, for Syria, for diaspora Jewry, and many more places and fronts. Everyone, literally everyone, believe me, everyone is waiting to see if a real change, will in fact take place in Israel and by extension in Israeli government policy. Come October 27th, it will literally be in the hands of the Israeli voting public. Let's hope for the best. And with that, let's get to Naysan Rafati. Hi, Naysan. Welcome back to the podcast.
Good to be back with you, Neri.
It's always our pleasure and my pleasure, Naysan, but especially on a week like this week, with a lot happening on your patch, which is all things Iran. Fair to say things have gone a bit pear-shaped, as the Brits say, since we last spoke in late April, and really over the past week, which we'll definitely get into in just a second. I wanted to set the table for our audience before we really start with some key dates and just a refresher on what has actually happened on the Iran front. So February 28th, obviously, the U.S. and Israel launched the war against the Islamic Republic. That lasted for about 40 days, after which a ceasefire was called on April 8th. Now, a few weeks go by. There are threats and counter-threats between the U.S. and Iran. But around June 15th, we get this proper agreement, if we can call it that, which they called the Memorandum of Understanding, the MOU, that aimed to ostensibly end the war, laying out this 60-day period where the U.S. and Iran, via the Pakistanis and the Qataris and other mediators, would actually thrash out a final agreement to fully end the war. Critically for our and everyone else's purposes, on the initial April 8th ceasefire, Donald Trump declared that the Iranians had actually committed to reopening the Strait of Hormuz, which didn't actually happen. But as part of the June 15th MOU, Clause 5, as you well know, the Iranians seemingly, and emphasis on seemingly, committed to, again, reopening the Strait of Hormuz, which, again, hasn't quite happened. And so since last week, especially, we've had this daily and growing escalation between Iran and the U.S. Iran has been firing on commercial shipping, transiting through the strait. The U.S. retaliates. Iran retaliates to that against U.S. military bases in the region. And things now seem to be getting worse once again, including earlier today, continued U.S. airstrikes actually during the day, which is new. And again, for our audience, we're recording this on Wednesday afternoon Tel Aviv time, Wednesday morning DC time, where you are, Naysan, just in case anything goes even more pear-shaped. So let's start here. We were promised, or at least I was promised, peace for our time just a month ago when this MOU was signed, or at the very least, a quiet summer or a more quiet summer. So what's gone wrong, really, Naysan, since the MOU was signed, literally a month ago?
More or less everything. So the MOU itself is a 14-point, two-page understanding. And there's one data point I would add to the chronology that you laid out, which is that once the ceasefire came into effect, the U.S. and Iran did try to have negotiations in Islamabad with Vice President Vance and the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. This was the highest level in-person meeting between the two sides since the 1979 revolution. And when those collapsed, the U.S. also put in its own blockade of Iranian shipping. And so leading up to the Islamabad MOU, you kind of see how the dynamics in that shaky ceasefire period informed the structure and the logic and the rationale of the MOU. The MOU is not a grand bargain. It's not even really a full diplomatic agreement. What it is a set of immediate priorities, immediate deliverables that both sides agreed to undertake, leading into a framework, as you mentioned, to start discussing nuclear issues and other things. So the notion behind it, the rationale behind it, is that both sides were basically experiencing mutually assured economic disruption. The Iranians had a blockade. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz was still being curtailed. You had these tit-for-tat exchanges. And the MOU basically tries to put a floor underneath that and say, okay, so the Iranians allow for shipping to go through the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. Lifts the blockade. The U.S. also allows for a waiver that lets Iran ship Iranian oil and petrochemical, and it commits the U.S. not to adding new sanctions. And by now, we've seen pretty much every element of that understanding collapse in less time than it actually took to negotiate. There were tit-for-tat exchanges, after the MOU was signed, but over the past several days, we've really seen that escalation sharpen up. The Iranians, a few days ago, attacked 3 tankers that were trying to transit the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. retaliated by revoking the waiver on Iranian oil and petrochemical sales. It started to reintroduce new sanctions as of last week. And then as of yesterday, as we're recording, it also reintroduced the blockade of Iranian shipping. Mm-hmm. So the MOU as a functional understanding, let alone a longer term framework for negotiations, seem to have unraveled fairly quick. Part of this is both the Americans and the Iranians arguing that article in the MOU that you referred to, Article 5, both sides are essentially saying that they were observing the letter of what it says as they interpret it, and the other side was violating the spirit of it. So the Americans say that the Iranians were not making good faith efforts to try to allow shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians say that the Americans were basically trying to build up a southern corridor along the shore of Oman and that this was breaching the spirit of the understanding because it was trying to subvert Iran's leverage over the Strait and kind of prejudicing against understandings that should have been discussed between Iran and Oman or between Iran and littoral states in favor of trying to build up this alternative to Iranians to Iran's northern side of the Strait of Hormuz. And from there, we've seen President Trump on the one hand, Iranian officials on the other hand, say that the MOU is essentially a dead letter and moving back into, to borrow from Clausewitz, rather than war being politics by other means, war being negotiations by other means.
Right. That's a good sum up. Literally everything is unraveled fairly quickly, as you mentioned. And I want to kind of spend a moment on this Article 5, this Clause 5 of the MOU, because obviously, as you mentioned, they both understand it and they're both reading it very differently. But who actually has the higher ground or the better case? Because according to what the Americans understood, or at least what they thought had been agreed to, that Iran would go back to the status quo ante from before the war, that essentially the Strait would be open for business, ships would go in, ships would go out, by the way, including Iranian ships, and that this kind of distinction between a northern corridor and a southern corridor, the northern corridor hugging the Iranian coast, southern corridor hugging the Yemeni coast, was not really an issue or wouldn't be material to the actual reopening of the Strait. So what are we kind of not understanding in terms of at least the Iranian understanding of all of this?
Well, it's not so much understanding and not understanding. It's that whenever you have language that is designed to get both sides to agreement, it inevitably kind of runs the risk of being interpreted in different ways, right? So the language of of Article 5 itself says that the Islamic Republic of Iran will make arrangements using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial ships, without tolls, without charges for a period of 2 months. And so that's, what the Americans, point to and say, you should be making your best efforts. It also says Iran will conduct dialogue with the Sultanate of Oman to define the future administration and maritime services in the Strait of Hormuz.
Aha.
And
that second bit is a problem.
So for the Iranians, the fact that the U.S. was, in their view, trying to actively encourage this southern corridor, and as you can see, the MOU doesn't mention a northern corridor, middle route, southern corridor. The Iranians say, well, the Americans were trying to put their finger on the scale and trying to essentially work on long-term erosion of Iran's leverage over the corridor by trying to support navigation through the southern route, rather than it being a subject of Iran-Oman deliberations, being something where the U.S. was more actively engaged in trying to bypass Iran's ability to control navigation through the Strait, which the Iranians say that's what the first part says, that it's up to them. So it's one of those things where you can understand why the negotiators try to come up with language that both sides can accept. The issue is that once you get past that point, you see that essentially everything that can go wrong does go wrong. You have two sides with very different interpretation of what that means. Absolutely no trust or willingness to kind of say, well, in the spirit of this, we will give you the benefit of the doubt type of thing. That's not. Trust is not a currency that overburdens the U.S.-Iran relationship. We also have, the fact that a lot of the engagement has been done through mediators. There are obviously direct exchanges between the U.S. and Iran, but if you look back to the periods where U.S.-Iran negotiations have generally made progress, they tend to happen when they are consistent, sustained, bilateral, and regular. Rather than trying to thrash things out through WhatsApp texts or through third-party mediators. And even at the end of June, there were delegations that were back on the ground in Qatar. They didn't actually physically meet, and they were discussing things like the access to assets, which was part of the understanding, and other things. So you see where the elegance of the diplomatic craft in trying to give language that both sides can sign off to immediately also opens up rooms for different interpretations, misinterpretations, mutual allegations of bad faith. I mean, for those who followed the JCPOA, there was all kind of debates over the language in part of the text that refers to nuclear capable ballistic missiles, right? And the Iranians would say, well, none of our missiles are designed to be nuclear capable, so you don't have to worry about it. And the Americans and the E3 would say, no, when you guys are testing some of these missiles, these could be nuclear capable, so we don't like that you're testing some of these missile systems. So where we are functionally is that the U.S. has now gone back to having this blockade in effect as of late yesterday, our time, right now. And the Iranians have been attacking ships, especially those that are trying to use the southern route. The diplomatic path does not seem particularly likely to be well trodden anytime soon. You can see the frustration in President Trump's remarks.
Yeah, well,
and you can say that the Iranians are kind of signaling their own kind of resolute interpretation of their position and their reading of the MOU.
Yeah, trust me, we'll get to Donald Trump in just a second. Just a final question with regard to the Strait of Hormuz, because even kind of analysts, journalists have a hard time actually ascertaining to the extent possible what is actually happening in the Strait today and in recent weeks. I mean, to the best of your understanding, traffic has kind of picked up, right? Or had picked up after the signing of the MOU. Maybe not all of it kind of official and public. A lot of the ships going in and out they shut off their transponders, right? So it's kind of shadow fleets going in and out. But there had been, I think, an increase in shipping in and out of the Strait. So is that kind of your understanding? And is that what Iran didn't like to see happening?
You're right. Traffic after the MOU came into effect, the blockade was lifted. We did see an uptick both in terms of Iranian traffic and non-Iranian traffic going through the Strait. You're also absolutely right that getting exact numbers on some of this stuff is an inexact science, because part of it is that not everything can necessarily be seen through tracking systems, and there are market firms that spend a lot of time doing satellite imagery trying to get precise counts of who's going through, what route they're using, what they're actually carrying, because the Gulf is we think of it as a gas entrepot of oil, LNG, but there's also fertilizer and humanitarian goods and all sorts of other traffic that goes through. So the Iranians, I think, the issue is not so much that traffic was rebounding; it's that in their conception, the development of the southern route was, with U.S. encouragement, something that was meant to essentially erode Iran's leverage over time, that this would be a card that they would not be able to continue playing. You have to, bear in mind, I mean, this very well, that, the U.S. and Iran go into negotiations for the most part, assuming the worst of the other side. And we've seen, President Trump say, the Iranians, were lying. They couldn't be trusted to abide any aspect of the deal. And the Iranians, say the same in the other direction. So, I mean, I think big picture, the Iranians over the course of this war, it's a bit of a paradox, right? They are militarily and economically weakened, but they have accrued this new form of leverage in the negotiations through flexing control over the Strait of Hormuz, which they had not traditionally done, right? Mm-hmm. When we were having negotiations between Iran and the US in June of last year or February of last year, the discussions weren't about Hormuz. The discussions were around the nuclear program and maybe trying to get other issues on the table, it's ballistic missiles and proxies, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact that, the US was willing to put economic concessions on the table, including access to Iranian assets and general license, the GLX that was issued last month.
GLX?
GLX was the light. So Iranian crude and petrochemical sales were under sanctions.
Right.
Prior to the war, they were able to circumvent those sanctions, particularly to China, and get 1.5 million to 2 million barrels a day to China. GLX, General License X, was issued by the Treasury and basically waived those sanctions and said that Iran can conduct oil and petrochemical sales and get paid for it. So the fact that the U.S. was putting those incentives on the table in return for not nuclear steps, there would be additional steps on sanctions relief if they got to a final deal that also addressed nuclear. But it shows that, despite the fact that the war has left Iran economically weakened and militarily weakened and in a politically, ambiguous place, it also gave it this new card to play. And it was of sufficient value that it became the fulcrum of the negotiations, right? It became the bit that the MOU puts up front.
Yeah.
The MOUs, like operable clauses, are about restoring freedom of navigation, not about the nuclear program, not about ballistic missiles, not about proxies, not about anything else. So for Iran, that leverage is something that they want to maintain, or at least not cash in until down the line.
Okay. And if we delve into the Iranian side of this equation, right? So they've started firing in earnest once again at shipping that's going through the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, are they trying to flex their muscles? Are they trying to shut down shipping entirely? I mean, what are they trying to achieve? And when you talk about leverage, is it to kind of establish this principle that not only do they have kind of control and authority over the strait, but that they need to get paid for the access in and out of the strait? Or is it, they're trying to maybe just assert more leverage in the context of the overall negotiations, but really it's more kind of a leverage play as opposed to, okay, this is a non-negotiable demand that we are now trying to assert via force, via fire on these ships, and not at the negotiating table?
Well, I think that the Iranians are trying to maximize leverage on all fronts, right? And we've seen this to a certain extent that they've when the negotiations were happening, they were pushing on the assets, they were pushing on control over Hormuz or some kind of recognition of their self-determined authority over the strait. Pushing back the nuclear discussions, to the extent they could, because especially when it gets to nuclear concessions, things like giving up fissile material are fairly irreversible, right? So those things, from their perspective, make sense to try to defer on. It sort of makes sense from the U.S. perspective as well. We can probably come back to that. But I think that they have established now that this is a fairly powerful card. I think they took away from the war that their ability to create economic disruption is a powerful card, right? They are outgunned by the U.S., but what they can do is spread the damage, and it can be both in terms of striking U.S. bases and striking U.S. allies, but also putting a significant economic global cost. And they, look at the midterms, they look at the price of gas, they look at the fact that, some parts of the U.S., in parts of the U.S., this has not been a particularly popular war, especially if it looked. Well, yeah. I mean, certainly within segments that there's still quite a bit of support for it, but I think overall there is a degree of skepticism, especially when the question arises that, well, what is the exact end game here? And with all of those considerations in mind, I think the Iranians basically think that they can. It's somewhat a mirror image of the logic that they had, during the war itself, which is that the imposition of economic costs is something that will push the administration here to make certain concessions. I mean, maybe they'll just say, okay, fine, accept a toll, right? Even though that has a lot of problems, both in terms of U.S. policy, international law, GCC states, precedent it sets elsewhere in the region. But to basically say, okay, maybe that's just the quickest way, is that fine. Now the likelihood of that actually being acknowledged or formalized is not particularly high. But I think it's in part a negotiations gambit. It's in part this sense that this newfound form of leverage is something that the U.S. is trying to atrophy, and the Iranians need to kind of preemptively prevent the atrophy and keep asserting it. And and we go back to essentially the same questions that were the strategic debates, before the MOU is who can withstand, who can tolerate pain for a longer period, whether it's economic pain or military pain in the case of Iran.
Okay, so they've gone. I'm going to get to the U.S. side of this in just a second. Trust me, the Donald Trump of it all. But I just have to kind of follow up with regard to the Iran side. All that being true, wouldn't it have been maybe the path of lesser resistance, or dare I say the smarter path, just to actually try to move forward with the MOU and the Hormuz issue? Okay, resolved, keep it open. Part of it, very early on, they were supposed to get, like you said, frozen assets and possibly sanctions relief. So they could have gotten an economic bump that way. And then maybe with an eye towards, I don't know, if not a grand bargain, then a lot more economic relief at the tail end of this MOU, and maybe trying to negotiate some compromise over the fissile material, the nuclear material, and the like. And by the way, the missiles and the proxies were completely not included in the MOU. So that's already kind of a point Iran relative to where they were, say, in January when they were negotiating with the Trump administration. So this may be a stupid question, but like, why are they taking the harder line and not maybe the smarter line?
Look, to start with a premise is that the Iranians desperately do need economic relief. They needed it before the war. They need it even more now. The Iranian economy is, I think we talked about it the last time I was on. When the protests started at the end of December, it was an economic trigger that kind of led that protest, this latest kind of round of nationwide unrest against the regime, to kind of be sparked in the first place. The currency was collapsing, the bazaar was unhappy, and that quickly led to this spread of protests in the first couple of weeks of January. The bill has continued to mount after the infrastructure damage. Some Iranian officials talk about 1 million to 2 million people being directly affected in terms of unemployment as a result of the strikes over the course of the war, the blockade compounding that effect. So all of that economic imperative that's been there, in past negotiations is even more so there now. But I think the Iranians also come at it with this deep cynicism and skepticism that the U.S. will follow through on its on what it commits to. And so, they say, or they would argue, or I think some people in the system would argue, that, look, what the Americans are basically doing is trying to buy themselves breathing space. And what they're trying to do is essentially have a hudna, which is, I know you're well familiar in your own neck of the woods.
Arabic word for, a temporary truce, pause.
A temporary truce,
yeah.
Right. And that, the U.S. was basically trying to bring down the price of gasoline before the midterms, give its military some reprieve after a couple of months of fairly consistent bombings, maybe bolster some of its assets in the region, and then try to build up this southern corridor as an alternative. And that everything the U.S. committed to turned out to be reversible. Right, the waiver was reversible. The assets were never accessed. The undermining of Iran's self-declared leverage over the Strait of Hormuz was being eroded, and that therefore, this was always going to end up in grief, in the sense that the incentives turned out to be reversible, and the U.S. interpretation of the MOU was, one that was basically trying to undermine what the Iranians thought they were getting out of it in terms of recognizing, their role over the strait. So if you view it in terms of, commercial interests, yes, the Iranians, by allowing the MOU to collapse, are giving up a fairly robust waiver if it had been fully implemented in terms of
selling
sanctions
oil.
relief.
Yeah.
Selling oil, selling petrochemical, being able to repatriate the proceeds, the billions that would have been accessed in terms of financial assets. But I think if you are sitting in Tehran, the promise of that was kind of set against the peril that all of this could be a mirage, that the U.S. could just be trying to restock, rearm, rehabilitate, and end up in a position
get through the midterms.
Yeah, I think among some of the Iranian establishment, that was always, the kind of underlying pessimism. And again, the proof would have been in the pudding if we'd actually moved into, pivoted immediately from the MOU into kind of a consistent, solid level of engagement where they actually hammered all of these details out. And like we said, sometimes the language you need to get a deal isn't the language you can execute a deal on. And so I think that's where at least some within the Iranian system see it, that this was never really going to go anywhere because the U.S. had no intent of keeping up its side of the bargain, which is exactly how some people in D.C. argue the Iranians were going to go along with it as well.
Got it. So from a certain Iranian perspective / logic, you press your advantage now as opposed to waiting a few more months down the line where you won't have as strong a card over the Americans.
Israel Policy Forum is a policy organization rooted in the Jewish community. Our mission is to build support for a secure, Jewish, democratic Israel through a viable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, advancing pragmatic U.S. policy towards the conflict, U.S.-Israel relations, and regional diplomacy among policymakers and community leaders. We promote policy measures endorsed by credible security experts, develop analysis and commentary, and convene programs that engage and educate leaders across the political, denominational, and generational spectrums. Our Young Professionals initiative, IPF at TEED, works to elevate the discourse among next-generation leaders by building community and facilitating engaging programs related to Israeli-Palestinian affairs. To learn more about our work, visit us online at israelpolicyforum.org and follow us on social media. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible and nuanced analysis, please make a tax-deductible gift today at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
Let's get to the Americans. It seems like Donald J. Trump finally lost patience around last week. So at the NATO summit in Turkey, he didn't hold back, even in Trumpian terms, very high bar. He said he thought the ceasefire was, quote, over. He called the Iranians scum and liars and cuckoo, and said they were, quote, incompetent because if they were, quote, competent, they would have made a deal a long time ago. So that's kind of from the Trumpian American perspective. And now we've had these escalating strikes by the U.S., primarily, and correct me if I'm wrong, targeting kind of military assets in the Strait, on the Iranian coast, southern Iran, but maybe a bit farther afield once or twice. And please correct me if I got that wrong. Like you said, he also reimposed the naval blockade on Iranian shipping out of the Gulf, which seems like a big deal. And yesterday, in a White House interview with my good friend Trey Yingst from Fox News, he threatened that next week he'd start hitting bridges, power plants, and maybe more down the line. So same question, but just to pose to the other side. What is Trump thinking, and what is he trying to accomplish with his own kind of escalation?
Well, just to add some color to the comments that he was making during the NATO summit, we also now know that there was apparently some intelligence reporting conveyed to the administration about potential threats to the president's life. The Iranians have, talked about that one way or another, and all of that was happening at the same time as these funeral processions for the supreme leader of Iran, where there were no shortage of provocative, posters and apparently language. So I don't think
it was Israeli intelligence that gave the Americans that information that there was some kind of plot against Trump's life.
Yeah, and you can see how, regardless of, strategy and negotiation dynamics, that issue probably kind of contributed to his degree of frustration and disappointment with the Iranians. And look, you're right. The U.S. Strikes that we've seen over the past week have been, growing. Right, you look at the CENTCOM readouts that come out, and goes from 40 targets to 50, 60 targets to 140 targets. And so it's a steady kind of degree of erosion, particularly in terms of Iranian air defenses and drone launch facilities and production sites and launch sites along the southern coast. And again, the rhetoric around moving up the ladder is something that we saw throughout the war. It's something that we've seen the president refer to in terms of going up the ladder and targeting critical infrastructure. And the U.S. does,
which he hadn't, he never did. There were a lot of ultimatums and a lot of threats.
Right, and I think that that's in part because one, there may be legal considerations about what constitutes a dual use bridge or a dual use energy facility and things like that. There's also the risk of what Iran does in retaliation, right? And over the past, we didn't touch on this, but I mean, I think over the past week, the Iranians have targeted no fewer than 5 regional states in these retaliations, right? It's been, Qatar, it's been Kuwait, it's been Jordan, it's been, several countries where the Iranians say they're targeting U.S. bases.
Yeah.
And so the risk in terms of escalating on the infrastructure side, whether it's in terms of energy facilities or desalination or oil, is that the Iranians may still have a capacity to retaliate in kind against Gulf energy structures, and that so the possibility is there, and the U.S. does have a ladder to go up if the president decides to do so. The Iranians would appear to have at least sufficient remaining, drone and missile stocks to be able to threaten
to respond to the
U.S. allies in the Gulf. Yeah, and so that's where you get into what is right now kind of a return of the dueling blockade efforts into something more that becomes potentially a regional energy crisis.
Yeah, well, we'll get to the scenarios moving forward and trying to project ahead, but just on the Trump question, he's clearly lost patience. He's angry that the Iranians are backfiring at shipping going through the strait. He's also angry that they're not in his words, competent enough to make a deal. He even told Trey in his interview yesterday on Tuesday on Fox News, quote, "I think they have no choice but to make a deal." So, I mean, is it just as simple as he's trying to coerce the Iranians into what? Making a deal, capitulating, backing down?
I think he'd probably take any of those three. It's a question of which one of them actually happens, right? And the theory of the case, you can say that we had in his first term maximum pressure, which was particularly primarily economic coercive tool that was intended to get a deal. And then in the second administration, the maximum pressure on the economic side, which has more recently been dubbed economic fury, has been complemented by the military element through epic fury and now the resumed blockade and everything else. And I think that you could say that there's this one of the kind of strategic tensions here is that, at least, in terms of his outward-facing remarks, President Trump's belief is that, the Iranians have lost. And the Iranians' belief is that they have won. And when you have that kind of inherent tension that, and he's not wrong on a lot of what he says, the Iranians, air defense capacities. I mean, we've seen today, CENTCOM is conducting airstrikes in daylight. That you have to have a pretty good degree of confidence in your ability to not be facing significant, air defenses to be able to conduct those kind of operations. And their economic situation is poor. Like, there is a lot in terms of like painting a picture of Iran having a lot of vulnerabilities, having a lot of weaknesses, having a lot of issues that a deal would start to put a balm on. The flip side of it is that they still clearly have enough capacity to create problems, whether that's in terms of and we saw this a couple of years ago in Operation Rough Rider and the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, that it doesn't take a huge amount of disruptive capacity in order to strangle or at least subdue shipping going through a choke point. Mm-hmm. And so, and for the Iranians as well, this campaign, started with the, targeted killing of Iran's supreme leader, right? Like if you're sitting in Tehran, this is the standoff that had always, been, on the cards, that this was the campaign to overthrow the regime. This was the campaign to get rid of the Islamic Republic. This was if not change the regime, then at least, lead to a failed state or a collapsed economy or a collapsed government. So that means that at least the Iranian system's pain threshold right now is pretty high. And, the blockade will compound the economic ills. The military strikes will add to Iran's military vulnerabilities. The question is, now that we get into this renewed cycle, or perhaps even escalatory cycle, going after infrastructure sites or additional military targets, beyond just the southern coast of Iran, will it lead to a fundamentally different outcome, either in terms of eliminating Iran's disruptive capacity against shipping and letting shipping going through because the Iranians can't target it anymore. And that seems like a fairly high bar when you need a drone or a missile to at least put a chill in terms of the maritime sector. Or that the Iranians, finally, get to this point where they really have to make an existential choice about, do we make concessions beyond what the MOU expected, at the risk of just a real, kind of collapse of the economy, collapse of Iranian infrastructure, collapse of services. And all the rest of it. So I think that, that also means that, it seems unlikely as we're speaking right now that we could get a Truth Social post in, by the time this comes out, saying, regional countries have, reached out and we're sending mediators back to Islamabad or Geneva.
We've seen it before.
Or Doha. We have seen that before. I mean, at this point, it would be trying to make a diplomatic turducken. In the sense that we would be trying to put a truce inside an MOU within a ceasefire, but it's you can't rule that out either.
I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So yeah, I think that it is a question of the fact that the one thing that the U.S. was immediately hoping to get out of the MOU was, relief from the economic disruption that affects not just the U.S., not just the GCC, but the wider global economy. That bit has not worked. The Iranians have continued to fire. The Iranians have
they've not backed down.
Played hard.
Yeah.
They've not backed down. They've played hardball, and so I think that we are now back in a position where the president is leaning to either that the blockade will, the blockade did have an economic effect. It will have more of an economic effect against the Iranian economy now. That the U.S. can up the ante in terms of escalation, and there are retaliatory risks. But if that means, kind of quote unquote finishing the job, whatever you interpret the specific job to be, then at the very least you put the Iranians in a position of having to make harder choices and maybe coming up with different answers than they did in Islamabad.
Yeah. You put that very diplomatically, as you normally do. Knowing you for a number of years, I sense a twinge of skepticism. But it brings me to my next question, right? Where do we go from here? It's fair to say neither side, as we've been talking about now for nearly 40 minutes, neither side is really willing to actually back down and make the necessary compromises. It still seems like neither side really wants to go back to full-scale war, like we saw for all of March and a bit of April and February. So what are the scenarios that we're actually looking at? People talk about 3 scenarios, right? Status quo, kind of this low-level contained hostilities, call it what you will, right? Centered around the Gulf and the Strait, but this kind of just continuing, mowing the grass, as I've heard one person in Washington call it, mowing the grass, at least from the U.S. side, and then kind of Iran, I don't know, mowing the MOU grass, or however you want to term it, on their side. Going back to kind of escalate, like full-scale war, right? So one day after the next, they start ramping up, both the U.S. and the Iranian side. So that's scenario number 2. Or scenario number 3, an off-ramp, some kind of deal. I don't want to, a truce turducken, but maybe a MOU 2.0, a bigger and better and greater MOU. I don't know. I mean, what do you think is a likeliest scenario?
In terms of, these are they're also more or less the scenarios that we would have been discussing during the ceasefire, even during the war, right? We are in. If you look at the trend line just of the past week, they have been moving up the escalation ramp, but not yet into that scenario of full out hostilities. Israel is not in the picture at this point, either in terms of Iran striking Israel or Israel conducting strikes in Iran. But even if you design the idea as the kind of status quo, or we've talked before about the Iran-Israel rivalry in terms of Syria, and the phrase people used for years was kind of the war between the wars. Now it's kind of a war within a war, right? Mm-hmm. Like this kind of jostling for leverage, trying to kind of keep things below a certain threshold, keeping infrastructure out of play, keeping energy and water and all sorts of things outside of the picture, and sticking. Yeah.
They call it in Israel kind of equations. So the equations on both sides, certain rules of the game that are kind of unwritten but understood by both sides.
Right. And the issue there is that it leaves a lot of room to get into a bigger escalation, even when you don't necessarily want it, right? So to move up from that scenario of yes, we can stay roughly where we've been the past few days, which is the Iranians take shots at boats, the US takes shots at central Iran, the Iranians target a couple of bases, don't cause major damage, major injuries. The blockade starts to, creep in. So the Iranians may, start to up the ante there. The U.S. may start to up the ante, as President Trump has said. He said yesterday, to your friend Trey, maybe next week the infrastructure will come into play. And again, he has said this before and not followed through. It's not always, you can't assume that past is always prelude. And it may be the case that at some point he does make a decision to do that.
Right. You
also have a scenario where one of the strikes that Iran conducts against a U.S. base does harm. Thankfully, touch on wood, at least in terms of the public reporting of what's happened over the past few weeks, there have not been injuries or fatalities reported in these Iranian attacks on U.S. bases. If that changes, then the U.S. retaliatory options could also change, and the U.S. could move into greater targeting of either Iranian individuals or infrastructure or other things in response to that. Now, we did have back-channel engagement, mediated conversations during the war, during the ceasefire, Even after, over the week, last weekend, I think the Iranians were in talking to the Qataris and the Omanis about some kind of fix in terms of Hormuz. So the channels, on that side don't close. The question is, how substantive are they, and how much are they likely to come up with a new solution at this point, right? So there's and it's not just the U.S. and Iran, right? Like the MOU side, as it related to Hormuz, was something that some of the GCC were a little bit worried about, right? Like that language around Iran being involved in facilitating transit and things like that was kind of read by some as like a little bit of a warning signal. Like so, and at the same time as the MOU, there was at least plans for some kind of regional track as well, like an Iran GCC discussion. And right now, the Iran GCC discussions are happening, through fire, including against countries that have been involved in mediation efforts, right? Like the Iranians have been targeting Qatar as part of the last couple of rounds of exchanges. So, the problem with giving a kind of soundbite response to which of those three scenarios is most likely is that they can all happen at the same time, right? And you can have an escalation at the same time as you have more intense diplomatic outreach. You can have the status quo of what we've had for the past few weeks, just kind of continuing. You can have the escalation without kind of any kind of off ramp, and you can have the off ramp and things kind of the what seems to be an increasing simmer goes back down. All of these things are possible. It's what happens when you're dealing with a very, very dynamic set of facts on the ground, to governments that have absolutely zero belief in the other one's noble intentions, and the fact that it doesn't always have to be a strategic choice to escalate, but can also be the result of a miscalculation or an individual incident that then cascades into a set of responses and counter responses. But right now, in terms of the functioning kind of dynamic, it's kind of this return to a belief that mutually assured economic disruption serves one side's purposes better than it serves the others.
Right. I think that's a fair answer. And despite the fact that as a journalist, we love soundbite quips, short quotes that we can use very, very, very diligently. I think that's the right answer. No one is quite sure where things can head.
Thankfully, we're doing a podcast in terms of me giving you a soundbite quote.
Yeah, but we also, they also break these out into kind of social media clips. So you dodged a bullet right there. Naysan Rafati says escalation imminent, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, GCC, that's the abbreviation, the Gulf Cooperation Council. So it's basically the Gulf states. That's shorthand for the Gulfies. Naysan, final question to you, and it's the most important one to my mind. It's about Israel. Basically, how does this impact me? And by me, I mean people here in Israel, and not just in Israel, but people who are concerned, worried, interested in whether Israel will actually get involved or be dragged into this renewed U.S.-Iran escalation. I mean, what do you think the chances are that? I know what my answer is, but essentially that Iran at some point fires on Israel and then Israel gets involved, or I think less likely that the Trump administration give Israel the green light to actually get involved again to help out.
Yeah, I mean, the Iranians have, made their usual set of threats against Israel. They have not, yet acted on it, and part of that is that, what they are targeting right now, or what they say they are targeting, are U.S. bases directly involved in the strikes on Iranian soil. right? So if there's a Iranian radar system, an American radar system somewhere, or an Iranian or a U.S. Base or something like that somewhere in the Gulf, they say that that is what they're targeting. That includes, close to where you are in Jordan.
Right.
Now, if you're Iran, striking Israel is very certainly going to lead to an Israeli retaliation. And I don't think at this stage the Israelis would be following the same target packages as the Americans, right? It would not just be coastal defenses, and it would, if passed as prelude, be against either whatever missile sites Iran has been able to rehabilitate since the ceasefire, maybe going after any indicators of resumed nuclear activity at any of the enrichment facilities or elsewhere. It could be infrastructure, and we saw that during the war the Israelis did take a few shots at infrastructure, steel production sites, and things like that are a significant source of revenue for the Iranian state. Like, they are big business. Mm-hmm. Or going after personnel again, right? And one of the questions has been, where's Mojtaba, the new supreme leader of Iran? Yeah. He wasn't seen in his father's funeral services, and you have three interpretations. One is that he's unavailable. The second one is that there's a security concern, and I suppose a third one is that you add aura to mystery by not having him trotted out. But I mean, the security one doesn't not make sense, and the fact that so many of the regime's upper echelons made guest appearances at the funeral, having not been seen for some time, already probably means that the Israelis have been tracking them rather closely to see where they went off to after those ceremonies were conducted. So in terms of the Iranian calculus right now, if the motives are retaliating against the U.S. military and increasing U.S. economic pain indirectly through the Strait and also by targeting its allies, then to go from there, the striking of Israel doesn't add a whole much at this stage, mm-hmm. especially weighed against the risks of having the Israelis double up U.S. capacities in terms of air power. I could be wrong, and they could make a decision to either directly or indirectly start targeting Israel. But that is one front that among all the others that is heating up has thus far stayed as it is, and hopefully for your sake and your ability to keep watching the World Cup without too much trouble of going into a shelter, that will remain the case.
Yes. The priorities in life, and I agree. I agree. I mean, all cutting aside, it doesn't quite make sense for Iran to take that step. At least not right now, because it would definitely mean a major escalation. But since you raised it, Naysan, I lied. That wasn't my last question. My last question is this: the World Cup is still on as we speak on Wednesday afternoon. In just a few hours, there's going to be I want to call it, another world war, but a separate world war on the pitch. England versus Argentina in the semifinal. Yesterday, France handily beat Spain. So, last question to you, Nate.
Spain handily beat France.
Right, Spain handily beat France. Yeah, of course. It wasn't even close for all of you who are following. La Roja are in the final. But England v Argentina. Naysan, is football coming home? Or England going to the final? What's your prediction? I'll press you on this prediction.
My allegiances lie to Arsenal Football Club, and
as we know,
as long as all of the Gooners who are playing in the semis and the finals come home healthy, and ideally one of them comes home with a trophy, that's good enough for me, regardless of what kit he's wearing when he's in the US, Canada, or Mexico.
That is such a cop-out. Unbelievable. I will take it a step further. I think England will beat Messi and Argentina in just a few hours, but Spain, I think, are just too strong. And alas, football will not be coming home. But our audience will be smarter tomorrow with regard to this semifinal, and then we'll find out what happens on Sunday. And hopefully Trump and the Iranians cooperate and that everything will remain at least on an even keel, relatively speaking, until after Sunday. And then we can deal with a summerless World Cup and a lot more free time on our hands. Maybe it won't be occupied by a war. With that, Naysan, I'll let you get back to what I'm sure is a busy day back in DC. So thank you, as always, for breaking it all down for us.
Great to be with you, Neri. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks again to Naysan Rafati for his generous time and insights. Also, a special thanks to our producer, Jake McGilliban, and our editor, Tracy Levy, as always, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so it can keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening, and please subscribe and spread the word.